Welcome to this Music Excellence London webinar on how ambitious should we be at Key Stage 3, delivered by the ISM Trust. I'm Leigh O'Hara, Director of Music at St Paul's Girls' School.
And I'm Katie Hasler, and I'm Head of Music at Woodford County High School.
Before we begin, a few technical points. You can't see us, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. You should be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. So if you have any questions, please type them in the questions box and we'll answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. What we aim to do in this presentation is to think about some of the things that came up at the recent Teach Meet with Music Excellence London in December, and really to look rather than at first access and things like that, which other people are doing with Music Excellence, to think a bit more about how ambitious we should be and where we might go with Key Stage 3 music. If you like, a bit of blue sky thinking, positive thinking, a bit of looking upwards. And I think a great aim from this would be that if only one thing changed in what you did in the classroom, that would be great after this webinar. So the first thing I want to do is just to go through how we started our Teach Meet, and we posed 4 questions. What does ambitious and challenging Key Stage 3 curriculum look like? What should our aspirations be for Key Stage 3 music in the classroom? Does that match up to what is expected in other subjects? And how do we ensure all students are challenged regardless of their ability or background? We chose these questions just to get discussion going in the thing. And by the way, if you find the text very small, if you're listening to this on a mobile phone, you can see all of these slides on the ISM website if you go to that address I gave earlier. So don't worry, you can find all these things again if you can't see them now. So I jotted down what people came up with. I'll just quickly read them in case you can't see them. Contextual understanding is what people felt would be ambitious in a Key Stage 3 curriculum. Oral skills, theoretical understanding, developing physical technical proficiency, performance and resilience. They thought it involved all students. It would reflect the cultural background of students. Think about what each student is good at and what their needs are. That it was constantly evolving. I think that's definitely true of all our curriculum. Balanced realism with ambition, which is something I think we'll touch on a few times today. Links to opportunities outside school or extracurricular. Has the confidence to let go and allow pupils to lead their own journey, another thing that will come up I'm sure, and abandoning levels, assess as they go. That's certainly something that always comes up every time you talk about anything to do with teaching. So that was what people at the Teach Meet felt would make an ambitious and challenging curriculum. In terms of aspirations, things that came up were, should everyone do GCSE music? Is this realistic or desirable? Should we cover the fundamentals for GCSE music through a Key Stage 3 curriculum, but subtly? A niche for everybody. Should there be a music tech club, a club for everyone, so it involved everybody? My favourite comment is about this. I like them to be musicians. This is something I hadn't actually thought about before, but I think that for me was the most exciting thing to think about, is that in the classroom these people, young people, are musicians, not just students. Musicians in the world, rather than just a musician in school. Pupils should gain listening skills and experience music through listening, have some of the same expectations of oral skills at Key Stage 4, and we should learn how to apply what we do like to our own music. People see music in the same way as other subjects is the last thing on there. And that was the next question that we posed. I think it's a really interesting question, especially the bottom here where it says, would students be able to say, I can't do this in other subjects? And I don't think they would be so likely, and that's something that came up a few times. Technical language we thought was something that had to be thought about in this respect. Homework, do we set homework? How much curriculum time do we have? Probably less in many schools. Should it compare at all? Is the question irrelevant? And also prior knowledge and experience, which is something in other subjects is much easier to know about due to the way the subjects are taught more consistently perhaps in primary level. And the final question that we posed was, how do we ensure that all students are challenged regardless of ability or background? And so in looking today at some more challenging ideas about curriculum and what we might do in the classroom, We always want to keep in our minds that we need to think about how we might involve everybody in these. It's all too easy, I think, to become obsessed with that and not think about looking upwards as well as involving everybody. So the things that came up in this were, are we too concerned with things being equal? Has that overtaken us and stopped us really being imaginative in what we do? It's all about being flexible. People are scared to talk about elitism and excellence, and that's something else that we'll definitely be touching on. And of course, what does excellence mean anyway? Something that I think is interesting is that we use the word excellence thinking we mean elitist, but actually you can be excellent in anything. And I suppose we want our students to be excellent at their own level. Should we talk about equity rather than equality? I thought that was quite a philosophical one to think about. Some people felt that music could be self-differentiating in the sense that I suppose the outcomes or how people take their own journey through, and perhaps that's how we design things as well. In something today, hopefully you'll see are designed in that way. And we thought it was difficult in performance-based projects really to do this kind of thing, but hopefully we might have a few ideas today that might make us think a little bit about that. So I hope that gives you a context of our discussions today. We hope they're going to be very positive. We hope you'll have some positive thoughts. I hope you'll be happy to put some questions to us that we can perhaps cover or discuss as well. So I'll hand over to Katie now for the next bit.
So we've asked a lot of questions so far, and obviously given a lot of things to think about that came up at our Teach Meet. And I'd like to go on by suggesting perhaps one answer or one solution to some of those questions. And to start with, I should introduce this by explaining why ambition is something I am particularly interested at Key Stage 3. So at a previous CPD event, I was asked to explain what I thought my perfect ambition would be, or my desire for students at Key Stage 3 at the end of Year 9. What would I want from them? And we were brainstorming this question, and I said, I would like my students to be excellent. I would like to see musical excellence. And I was criticised by another participant in the particular seminar that I was at for this being a bit elitist. So just like Leigh's been suggesting, it is easy sometimes to think of excellence as being elitist. And the criticism that I faced was that that was therefore not an inclusive idea, because not all students would be able to realise excellence. And I didn't agree with that, and I'm sure many others don't. The fact that we're here for Music Excellence London suggests that it is something that we'd like all students to be able to achieve. But I went away and I spent some time thinking about this idea of elitism and whether wanting all students to achieve excellence really was an elitist idea. And my research into this, and this is where it gets a little academic for a couple of minutes, took me to a particular theory, which was Lamont and Mayton's legitimation code theory. This is from their article, Unpopular Music, Beliefs and Behaviours Towards Music in Education. And this particular theory is a series of codes, essentially. Here it is, a bit of information, which aims to define what the basis of achievement should be in certain areas. And you can see a little more background information on the screen. And when this particular idea was applied to music education, some interesting things came out of it. So they have these 4 different knowledge codes defining what is needed to achieve. And when they applied this to music education, they found that at Key Stage 3, students needed to have what was called a knowledge code. So that the idea there was that they had to have skills and knowledge, they could be taught those, and that would allow the students to do well. However, when they got to Key Stage 4 and GCSE music, this suddenly shifted to an elite code. The idea there, they found amongst students, was that the students felt you had to be a certain kind of person to take GCSE music. Not only did you have to have knowledge and skills, but it was also about your personality and something innate. And that's where it started to feel a little bit elite. And the idea being that maybe not everyone is able to take GCSE music, not everyone can be a musician. So when I read about this, what I took away from it was that perhaps actually it's very important for teachers at Key Stage 3 to impress upon our students that they can be this person, this type of person who can take GCSE music, and that we need to obviously in some way inspire students to feel that they are real musicians, and therefore we can get rid of this whole elitism. It concerned me slightly that if we started to think ourselves that excellence was elitist, that we were actually perpetuating this idea that not all students can take music past Key Stage 3. So for me it became vital that actually we as teachers are ambitious for our Key Stage 3 curriculum in order to enable students to feel like they are real musicians and that they can access those higher levels of musical education. So, academic bit over, this led me to actually go away and do something quite practical, which was thinking about my Key Stage 3 curriculum design in terms of how I could be ambitious and how I could ensure that students finished Key Stage 3 feeling like they were real musicians and that they were therefore able to access whatever they wanted to next. So I started off by thinking about the different options for Key Stage 3 curricula. First of all, many music departments use this one. You may recognise something similar. This is what Martin Fortley calls a Cook's Tour approach. So the idea that throughout years 7 to 9 you would study various different topics, some of which might be related, many of them wouldn't, for half a term, something like that, and then moving on to the next topic. And Martin Fortley criticised this idea, saying that this doesn't necessarily enable progress because students are using the same skills again and again, but they're doing them in different contexts. The knowledge, the focus rather, is very much on knowledge as opposed to on developing skills. So that's one approach which does appear often in curricula. An alternative approach is that of a spiral curriculum. This particular example comes from a charanga curriculum, and that is an example of how you might consider moving through a progressive curriculum where you're building the same skills, the same kind of ideas in music, but every year you're progressing and you're building upon them in different contexts. So this sort of image suggests that progress is maybe a little bit easier when you've got spiral curriculum. But is that the only way? So what I came up with after I was thinking about my own curriculum in our school was keeping some elements of a Cook's Tour, which I think a lot of teachers enjoy, where you get to look at obviously a wide variety of different styles of music, but also building in some progress and a sense of progress throughout Key Stage 3. The benefits, I think, of trying to combine the two are that you keep the variety, but you've also got inclusivity, so a wide range of different styles of music are covered, which hopefully appeal to a wide range of students and allow them to build on their own pre-existing experience and knowledge of music, but also that you are learning skills and developing them as you go along. So this is the current curriculum that I teach in my school at Key Stage 3. Now, when you first look at this, it may appear fairly similar to the previous slide that I showed you of the Cook's Tour. You can see, obviously, we still have a wide range of different topics that we study, combined in the middle with a wider opportunities project, and currently that is a brass project. So you can see Year 8, who are split into two halves in their year group, are each studying brass instruments for half of the year. So as it stands, just before February half term, half of our Year 8 have just finished learning trumpets, cornets, trombones and baritones and are doing their final concert on Thursday, and the other half of Year 8 will be starting right from the beginning the week after half term. But with that one exception, this is still pretty much a Cook's Tour approach with a whole range of different topics being involved. So each year I tend to audit the Key Stage 3 curriculum in conjunction with my department, and we look at a range of different things to ensure that our curriculum is working for us and working for our students. We look at a range of new trends, so we looked at the new Key Stage 3 curriculum when that came in. The London curriculum, you can see there in Year 9, there's a topic called Music of London, which is directly based on that idea. Sometimes we teach for specific projects, like the Royal Opera House Fanfare project is one that I've taught for in the past to enable students to enter the competition. We regularly update our resources, add new schemes of work, all the sort of thing that I'm sure you're all doing in your own music departments. However, recently, when, as we all know all too well, assessment changed in Key Stage 3, we decided to do a bit of an audit on progress and assessment and really try and understand what was the progress that we wanted our students to make throughout Years 7 to 9 in order to ensure that we were assessing them appropriately along the way, but also fully preparing them for whatever they wanted to do next and ensuring that they were achieving the most that they could as musicians. So this review process began with thinking about what the key skills were that students might be developing at Key Stage 3. And I imagine this is a type of review that many of you might have undertaken in your own music departments. So we considered the national curriculum and looked at what we needed to be studying from there. We had a look at GCSE specifications and considered what the skills were that students ought to be learning to prepare them for the next step. We looked at the ISM frameworks for assessment and considered all of the different options that were suggested there. And then we sat down and thought about what we as the teachers in our own school thought were the most important skills to develop. Now, this may sound like a long-winded process, but the outcomes were not groundbreaking. We started off with coming up with the following. There we go, very ungroundbreaking indeed. We wanted students to learn to perform, to compose, and to listen and appraise music. Obvious so far. But what we then went on to do was actually come up with the different areas that we were interested in within that. And then we continued like this. So these were the kind of key skills that we were looking at, broken down into those various areas, colour-coded, as you will see, which will come through later. And again, I should add, as Leigh said earlier, if this is all too small for you to read on your screen at the moment, don't worry, this PowerPoint will be available on the ISM website, so you'll be able to look it up and see it in a little more detail at a later stage. So these are our different skills that we wanted students to develop throughout Key Stage 3 and to work upon. And then we went into a little bit more detail. I'm not going to read through all of it, but you can see the kind of really specific skills that we wanted students to achieve. And we considered what we wanted them to get to, where we wanted them to get to, and what was going to be important for them to learn. So we then went on to do, there's a little bit more there about how we were going to assess this as well, of course, because that's where that all came from in the first place. We then moved on to do this incredibly complicated looking curriculum map. So this was a skills map of where in each of our different topics within that sort of Cook's Tour approach, we wanted students to develop particular skills. So we went through everything that we currently taught, looked at what skills they were learning or that we wanted them to be learning in those different topics, and colour-coded them a little bit more to theoretically make it a bit easier to understand, although potentially it just looks very rainbow-coloured on your screens at the moment, but it did help at the time. So this was our skills map, which really showed us where we wanted students to get, and it enabled us to check that all of the skills that we wanted students to develop were coming up throughout that curriculum, and that we weren't just touching on them once and then ignoring them again, but they were actually coming up through Year 7 and Year 8 and Year 9. Okay, so this may not be very clear yet as to how this might work in the real world. I think a lot of sort of what this is that you're seeing on screen now is, you know, what was sort of in my head and in my colleagues' heads when we were considering things, and there's all sorts of contextual information about our particular students and the way we teach things that obviously can't really be shown on one slide. But to give you a bit of a better idea about how this might work in reality, I'm going to just show you a little map of one element that we wanted students to develop. So creative use of musical devices was one of those key skills that we want students to develop from Year 7 through to Year 9. And as you can see from this little map that's starting to appear on your screen, by the time they finish Year 9, we wanted our students to be able to use musical devices in a way that was comparable with GCSE expectations, such that when they got to their GCSE courses, if they chose to take them, they would be able to compose in such a way that would enable them to achieve well at GCSE. Now, obviously, not every student is going to take music at GCSE, but nonetheless, hopefully this would still give them a very good grounding in musical, in this case, composition, which they could take on whatever they decide to do in the future. So, now mapping this through our different topics that were mentioned before, you can see right at the start of Year 7, students do a graphic score module, and they're looking at rhythmic pentatonic composition, nothing too complicated yet. As we go through Year 7, they move into program music, so they're starting to get a little more structure, ostinatos, drones, considering a simple tonality, a bit of a ternary form structure coming along. And then towards the end of Year 7, we start using those ostinatos within a more complex texture, looking at a different structure, a little bit more complicated than the original ternary form. Moving into year 8, they're studying samba. We want to look at rhythmic ostinatos now with a polyphonic texture and again a different structure. So we're still taking some of those ideas, those musical devices, but bringing it forward a little bit. And then they get to a remix task in year 8 where they are using melodic ostinatos now, developing those into longer melodies over a ground bass and with a different tonality. Still C major, nothing too complicated, but nonetheless they're developing those use of devices that they had previously. In year 9, they start to extend that even more in a film music topic, so considering rhythmic and melodic composition, new devices there, chromaticism, diminution, all sorts of things which are going to be new to them. And then their final chance to develop this skill in year 9 is when they write a pop song, where they really are writing extended melodies. We've got a much more extended structure, focusing on chord sequences, extended chords. Modulations isn't there, but that's another thing that they look at in that topic. And you can see by the time they've got to writing a pop song in year 9, that's actually something which is going to stand them in very good stead for going through into GCSE, where they might be using a pop song as one of their compositions. So this is just to give you an idea of how just one of those skills that we were looking at might be developed through that kind of Cook's tour, different types of topic approach, but nonetheless allowing students to make progress as they go through the curriculum. So what I haven't mentioned yet really is the assessment issue. I'm not going to talk about that now, that's a completely different ballgame, but it is built into this idea of a progressive curriculum whereby we would be assessing students according to progressive criteria. So we would be looking at what skills we would want them to have developed in each topic and assessing each one as they go along. So what you might be assessed on obviously in year 7 would be much less, I suppose, or less ambitious than what you are assessed on in year 9 in order to enable students to make progress as they go through. So this brings me to the end of my explanation of our progressive curriculum design, but I hope it gives you kind of an idea of something you might think about in your own curriculum when considering assessment or considering just what are the topics that you are teaching at the moment to Key Stage 3. That actually I feel that in order to be ambitious with our students, it's key to have a curriculum that really does enable them to progress and to build upon what they've learned as they go through topic by topic, so that they're not just repeating and repeating, but they really are gaining new skills and gaining new abilities as they get through to year 9. I'm going to hand back over to Leigh now, who's going to talk to us a bit more.
Thanks, Katie. I should say, I think on assessment that there's a Music Excellence London event coming up to do with that. I'm not sure if it's a Teach Meet or another webinar, but probably if you're interested in assessment, as I suspect many of you are, you might look that up. My slides don't look as good as Katie's, I'm afraid, but here is the next one. So having talked about curriculum, perhaps now we could talk a little bit about some things you might actually do in the classroom. None of these things are going to be things that are groundbreaking necessarily, or things that we think are the best, absolutely ambitious things ever. I hope we can think about them in the context of that's something you might try. If you haven't, you might think these are too ambitious, in which case you might think A, why not try it and see, or B, what can you do to change it to make it work for your students? And equally, it would be brilliant if you thought they weren't ambitious enough, and you might ponder actually how to make them more ambitious and how much further you could go. So there's 3 clips now which were people who at the Teach Meet in December just demonstrated for us, and if you can't hear them clearly or see them clearly, don't worry, they are on the Music Excellence website somewhere, so you can find them again. The first one is about teaching an African song, so let's have a little look, a bit of this. I won't show you all of it, but here it comes now. It gets louder when the people start doing it.
Oh, it's 12 actually. So group 1, group 2 is 4, and group 3 is 4. So we'll start with the C. Sol, mi, oh, sol, mi, sol, mi, oh, sol, mi, that's group 1. And then group 2 is sol, mi, oh, sol, mi, sol, mi, oh, sol, mi, and group 3 is sol, mi, sol, mi, sol, mi, sol, mi, oh. And so that repeats throughout the cycle. And then when I point into my head, it's sumikuma, which means hold my heart. Okay? So sumikuma, and you say sumikuma, 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 come on sumikuma, sumikuma, and then that repeats. And then you go back to the beginning, and it's son you may, and we're using our hands. Son you may, oh son you may, son you may, oh son you may, son you may, son you may, son you may, oh. And then we finish with dynamics. So we go son you may, so you're holding that son you may, son you may, son you may. We crescendo, and I get the whole class to go. Whoa! It's good. So should we try it? Yeah. It's year 7 class 7. So we start with a pulse. We get the pulse through the beat. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left. Son you may, oh son. So we stop here. Son you may, oh son you may. 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 Son you may, oh son you may.
Give you an idea of that. Obviously you wouldn't go that quickly with a group of young people, but I think gives you an idea of what he was trying to do there. You can hear the whole clip on Music Excellence. What I like about this one is it's singing in parts quite quickly. It's using, you've got some interesting cultural references there, with African song and language and communication. Also the idea of movement while you sing, holding a pulse. There's lots and lots of difficult things about this, and even as adults doing it, we really had to concentrate doing this singing task. So that's a really good example of what you can do, just a very simple, repetitive bit of singing involving 3 parts and harmony, rhythm, pulse, and everything like that. The next one is here, and this one is purely rhythmic. Rhythm is that great leveler. If you have students perhaps who are more experienced on their instruments, you might have some students who've got grade 5 or anything. Actually, they often can find this quite challenging. So have a little look at this, give you an idea of what might be possible here.
Start off with this, just get straight semi-plates going. The best way I find something that sounds like an egg rolling down a hill. The way I tend to sing it is it's a style of music from the northern instruments. In 2, keep repeating that word into the 2 pulse. It's so it's not it's not quite in time, basically. It's almost semi-late playing on, but it's the acronised version of it. So we try and play that now, emphasising the obviously you're not going to get it straight away. Often the instruments can be in a samba back to it. So that's kind of starting point for that. But then we're actually going to learn American 2 using our bodies. So slow down, we're going to be going. So what I'm doing, all these are the ghost notes. These are the accents that we played on the bass drum in Mac 2 is called the amplifier.
So believe me, that was very difficult to do. I think we got it in the end. A great example of using the body, different parts, rhythm. It relates to a certain kind of rhythm. It's probably quite hard to explain in words or even in notation, but this method really helps you to feel it. And I think the way he used the body, again, you can see the whole video and how it all came together. I think we did quite well in the end. And finally, we have another singing task, this one involving the use of numbers in order to teach a piece, I think from one of the syllabuses, singing syllabuses. Have a listen to this one finally.
1 1. 4 4. 5 5 3 1 1. 1 1. 4 4. 5 5 3 1 1. 1 1. 4 4. 5 5 3 1 1. 1 1. 4 4. 5 5 3 1 1. 1 1. 4 4. 5 5 3 1 1. 1 1. 4 4. 5 5 3 1 1. 1 1. 4 4. 5 5 3 1 1.
Hopefully that's got your feet stamping at least. What I love about this one is, again, you've got singing in parts. It's really fantastic to teach something like that without speaking, just pointing, using hand signals to show the levels, and using numbers I think is really exciting as well, because you can do all sorts of things when you use number and pitch like that. For instance, with notation, you can actually write that down pretty much pitch-wise if they understand the concept of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 5 notes, for instance. And I think there's lots you can do with that one going forward into composition or performance. And I think you can very quickly build that up. But I really particularly like the use of numbers in that one, and the idea that we can link that to notation, and notation is something that will come up a bit later. So that's 3 examples. You can see those on the Music Excellence website of things people are doing in the classroom. Again, you can take those and tailor them to your own students, or you can say, my students could do something much more complicated than that. Fantastic. Get out there and get them singing in even more parts and using more notes. Fantastic. Next thing I want to talk about is something we use, and I think something that's particularly powerful in the classroom, is about layers with performing and composing. Many of you may well already use Michael Nyman's Timelapse. I can't play it to you or even show it to you, because obviously there's copyright things about Michael Nyman, but you can find it online. There are teaching resources based around it. The idea of Timelapse, a bit like the BBC's 10 Pieces, is that you have different layers of music that all fit together. So you have, it's a ground bass actually, a repeating bass line, and over the top there are various different lines, and they all fit together. And you can get a class performing this really quickly. You can either use notation if they read music, or show them music anyway, and if not, you can teach them by rote. And it's great because it's the simplest line you can definitely show them the music for, and you can really use it as a way of getting them into notation. And you can get their class performance going really quickly. It's very repetitive. And then you can use that for composition approach to it too. You can use it in composition where they might divide it up, make a structure, decide who plays what, and you can easily create these things. Now this morning, I don't claim this to be very exciting, but it's something I just did very quickly to prove to myself how quickly you can put these things together. So here is an example based on that same concept you'd find if you found that resource for Timelapse. So here you've got 5 lines. It only says violins and cellos because I couldn't work out how to take them off, but it doesn't matter what the instruments are. There's 3 treble clef and 2 bass clef. And if you work up from the bottom, you've got the most simple line at the bottom that you could teach anybody to perform, to sing, to play. Of course, you could have percussion as well without pitch. And you could definitely, I would hope, have people able to read the notation of these lines as they go up. And as you go up, they become more complex. Minims on the second line up, quavers, syncopation, and the top line having faster notes and some chromaticism as well. A little bit of chromaticism slipped into the second line as well. The great thing about this is you can do so many different things with these kind of layered approaches. You can build it up yourself in front of them. You can show them how to create a composition like this. If your students are really already fairly experienced composers, you might explain how to make a multi-layered piece using the same chord. You might also encourage them to write their own line. It'd be very easy once they've learned this to put their own line in. If you show them the concept of the fact the first bar is C, E and G mainly, and the second bar A, C and E, etc. So they can see how very quickly, I was impressed even of myself with this, I just put it together using a very, very simple harmony, and it sounds quite good. So you can use the composition, you can use performing, you can use it for an enormous number of different things. So I think you can use the notation. You can show them how notation works using a thing like this. It's very, very simple. You can show them the concept of how we make things fit together. That sounds really complicated in music, but actually if you use the same chord for each bar and many notes on the chord, it's going to fit. You've got a wonderful chance here for students to find their right level on these lines, and of course encouraging them to go up, if you like, the score. so they get to the more complicated lines, and you might find some of them hopefully go further up than they thought they would. For composition, you can get them to deal with structure, because of course if the lines fit together, you can have 2 lines fitting together or 3 lines. You can have a top line playing with the bottom line, you can have just the bottom 2 lines together, and we find that very quickly students can build up rondo type structures where perhaps the main section A is all of these parts together, and then the B section they might decide just to have the top 2 lines, the C section just the bottom 2 lines. So they can explore structure, and obviously they can add dynamics and things like that, and the more able can add their own lines and actually compose along to this too. So I find these things fantastically flexible, and I would really encourage you, if you haven't, to explore these kind of layered pieces. The other thing you can do, of course, is do this to a pre-existing piece of music. If you want your class to perform a certain piece, maybe a piece you're looking at, then of course it's very easy to take a piece of music and isolate the important notes and put them at the bottom of your score, the simplest line, and have the melody at the top. And if no one can play the melody, you can do it. So I think this is a really fantastically flexible resource. And I would always recommend giving them the notation, even if they don't read music. Hopefully you've taught them to read, and they'll learn to play, and then they can get a sense of what it looks like each part. When you hear something like this, it's really clear the part at the bottom, which is doing very little, looks like that, and the part at the top that's very busy looks like that. And I think students very quickly can engage with this kind of score. What a 5-line score, actually, quite a complicated thing, but it doesn't take long to get for them to engage with it. So I find this a fantastically useful thing. And actually what we're using here is the ideas of a sequencer, if you like, but live. So students can take their own line, they can cut and paste themselves, they can loop themselves, and you can very quickly develop a very complex piece out of a very short section of music, which you can make as complicated or simple as you want. And of course we actually do also use sequence projects. So we use GarageBand in my school. You can use other sequencing products from other providers. They're all cheap. Many students have them on their phones or iPads or whatever they have for free these days. And again, it's just like the last task. It's about exploring layers, and I think we forget just how much you can do in something like GarageBand that students tend to find quite easy to use, especially if they're used to using their phones these days. So I would expect my students to have structure, tempo, dynamics, and all sorts of things in GarageBand, just the same as any other composition. So we found this to be a really great way, again, of getting everyone involved, but involving complicated musical ideas. Writing a piece that has tempo, structure, dynamics, maybe shape, maybe a climax, and an ending. On GarageBand, there are pre-existing loops. You can get them to write their own loops. We get ours to write their own from scratch. We haven't even told them the other ones exist. They probably know. And so again, you can experience your range. Now we also go into more depth with we do this in Year 9 often, and we look at minimalist techniques such as phase shifting, metamorphosis, additive melody, and things like that. And we also expect them, using a sequencer, to be able to fit the parts exactly together. So when you record, you can cut parts, squash them up, make sure they fit exactly, and we produce them. And they produce, here's some examples. I'm not saying these are the most fantastic things you're ever going to hear, but these were done very quickly by students just following them. I thought it would be nice to hear some students who've done something. So these are a couple of GarageBand examples. Here's the first one. Oops. It's going to play at any moment. There it is. So I think a very little piece made in one lesson, exploring layers, exploring shape, exploring what fits together. They've written the parts themselves. Again, it's about layers. I think layers are such a fantastic way of encouraging them to do something more complicated. Just a little bit of this second one as well. So a great minimalist piece developing already there, just by layering up simple ideas, understanding the concept of what fits together, but using GarageBand. So these ones were done by playing in, recording, exploring what's available on these sequencers. And I just lastly put a couple of examples. We give them quite detailed worksheets of what they can do, how to shop. And I think when we're using technology, we shouldn't shy away from making sure they use it properly. So we make sure they crop their ideas to the right length, make sure they fit exactly together, and that everything is working and the balance is right as well. So they're not just inputting their ideas and composing, but they're also engaging with musical concepts such as balance and things actually fitting together, the beat and the pulse. So there's just a few examples of those. You probably won't be able to read them, but you read a bit more if you go onto the ISM website. So hope that gives you a sense of some of the things that I think are quite interesting. Katie's now going to take you through the Woodford groove.
I am, yes. So Leigh's already touched on notation as being something that perhaps we should be considering when we're teaching Key Stage 3. And I think it's safe to say that notation can be a little bit of a thorny subject. It's something that people often are not quite sure how much they want to teach at Key Stage 3, whether or not they want to really teach it full on. Is it boring if you just teach notation and everyone's sitting there writing and no one's playing any music? Is it something that maybe sort of isolates a few students who have never done it before? Is it something that's difficult to teach? And I mean, we had a lot of conversations about notation at the Teach Meet that we mentioned that happened back in December. And I think quite a lot of what we said and what came up in discussion was there was perhaps some sort of subtle ways that notation could be taught. And that's perhaps a little bit like what Leigh was explaining just now with his project, that you could give students notation, they could look at it, maybe they don't have to be able to read it, but it's something that they can be kind of thinking about and coming to understand gradually, almost sort of by osmosis. But I'm going to show you a little example of a one lesson activity that I do with Year 7, which does tackle notation head on, there's no escaping it, but which I think is a nice example of maybe a slightly more ambitious way of teaching notation to ensure that students can access it and they do understand how it works. I think it's sort of, from my point of view, you wouldn't expect a student to go into an English lesson not being able to read a word, so why would you expect students to never learn to read a note in 3 years of music teaching? Perhaps that's my particular point of view is quite strong on that one, but at the same time I hope this is something that you might consider would be appropriate for your own students. So my particular lesson is based on understanding rhythmic notation and aiming towards performing something, as Leigh said, called the Woodford groove. So I start off by introducing the different notes in a fairly standard way. The words that I give them are based on, here we go, going through the PowerPoint, you can see this is exactly what my students would see. The words are based on the song that we would sing at some point sort of not too far into the lesson. So we would have a think about what these are, what they're called, what they sound like, we would clap them, we would say the words in rhythm and all this sort of thing. And then we would get to a song which is We're Going to Walk Up the Mountain. So to give you a little burst of my singing, apologies in advance, it would have a piano accompaniment and we would start by singing We're gonna walk, 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 walk up the mountain, gonna walk, 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 walk up the mountain. It's fairly simple. I won't sing you the whole thing. You can probably imagine how it goes. And then I might shout quavers and we'd all sing, and now we're running, 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 running up the mountain. Or I might shout minims and then we're gonna stroll, stroll up the mountain, or we might be snoozing on the mountain. You get the idea of how this works. It's very simple, and it's something that actually some of the students have sung something very similar down in primary school, but nonetheless it's something that everybody is able to join in with, and it straight away gives that sense of what these different notes sound like. So having done that, we then move on to reading notation. Straight away, can you clap these rhythms? And I mean, by this point they all can, because they can look at it and they can say, well, that goes walk, walk, stroll, and they can clap the rhythm, and it's no problem at all. So we go through several of these. I'm just giving you a few examples so you can get the idea, but we do about 15 of them when we do it with the class, and they have to try and do it first time, and then we try it again. And then we get to this. What is this mysterious symbol? And some of them inevitably will already know and be able to explain to us all about the concept of a rest. And that then leads us on to being able to read slightly longer rhythms. So we go on to 2-bar rhythms where we have bar lines, we have repeat signs, and now we've got those rests in there as well. So we bring these up, and again the students are clapping through and they're working out how they go, and they're repeating them as well because we've got the repeat sign in there, and we go through a few of these, and at some point they'll start to notice there are some names of instruments appearing in the corners. So we go through all the different rhythms, and then eventually once we've clapped them all and worked out how they all go, we get finally some sheet music, the Woodford groove. So here we've combined our 5 different rhythms, and now we can actually see these are the instruments they are intended to be played by. So students are divided into groups in the classroom, they practice their rhythm on the particular instrument that they have picked up, and then we put it all together to create a little piece where, you'll hear in our example, some of the time we have the polyrhythmic texture with everybody performing at once, and sometimes we isolate the specific rhythm. So here's a little blast of some Year 7s performing the Woodford groove. You get an idea of how that works. So this is a great way of just introducing the students to the rhythmic notation, and by the end of this one lesson every student has learned how to read our basic music notation lengths. We don't normally include semiquavers just yet, partly because they don't really fit into the whole walk, running, stroll thing. I normally use caterpillar, and that doesn't make a lot of sense going up the mountain, but that would come in to the next lesson. And the other thing that they might be doing in the next lesson is starting to compose some of their own rhythms, and I normally help them out with that to begin with by using something a little like this. So they've got their sort of rhythm boxes whereby each empty box at the top is one beat, and then they have got down at the bottom, and I would give them a couple of sheets of these to cut out and move around. They've got their different note lengths, and you can see that they are designed to fit perfectly into the right amount of boxes such that they can only fit 4 beats in each bar. So students would cut these out and they'd move them around, blue tack them on, try playing their different rhythms and come up with their own groove using a variety of different 2-bar rhythms. So just another idea of how we might be a little bit ambitious, ensuring that all of our students learn how to read rhythmic notation right at the start of Year 7, but hopefully still including a lot of interesting musical creative work at the same time.
So that comes to the end of our presentation, but we do have a question here, and if any rest of you are thinking of something you want to ask, do feel free to type it in now. I've got a great question from Claire, who's talking about the computer-based project, about whether we go on to add melody. She says she uses Cubase and finds the layering works, but actually that adding a clear melody is much more difficult. So thanks for that question, Claire. Yeah, we do add melodies onto them, and it is much more difficult, isn't it? Because it's very easy to get them to build all these textures up with chords and chords and chords. We do various things with melody. One thing we do with the 12-bar blue project, actually, earlier on, which we also do with this, is once they've got their layers in, it's a great chance for improvisation, especially in a computer-based project where there's not necessarily notation to get in the way, so they can just listen and explore what might fit with the melody lines. That's one good way that we use with it. I think we do teach them melody writing earlier on about the idea of 4-bar melodies and melodic structure and repetition. But one of the things I always think works really well with melody is if they do understand the notes of the harmony in each bar, and most of those loops are pretty much one chord for each bar or chunk. I find that it works if you get them to put one note in the melody per bar or per section, and then at least that works and get a nice shape, and then fill the gaps in. It's a bit like the top line, I suppose, on the little layered thing I did earlier, where the top line really is just a C major chord with some notes in between the C and the E and the G. And those are the ways I would use to build up the melodies. And it does work surprisingly well. I find that if they do write one note per bar that fits with their chords and then just fill in the gaps, perhaps even by improvising or fiddling around with it, just as, I always say to them, that's what composers do. I love the fact that apparently that wonderful tune in Dvorak's Ninth Symphony was written at the piano by trial and error, according to Dvorak. So I was thinking, you can write a great tune like that by trial and error, so can they. So that's some of the things that we do to get them to write melodies over the top. But I certainly agree, it's definitely the most challenging part of it. But I think if they get one note in per bar, at least that gets them started, and that will sound melodic, even if it's not the most interesting melody to start with. But we certainly cover it elsewhere with 12-bar blue improvising, and we do teach them about melody writing, I think in Year 7. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we do with adding a melody on. We don't have any mail questions at the moment, but I don't know if there's anyone dying to ask. You can. We do have. I think it was interesting listening to Katie's last thing on the rhythms. Again, it's that layered approach, which I just think is so brilliant, that you can get students to layer up a piece. And rhythm's wonderful because it sounds so complicated so quickly, even though actually the rhythmic units we're using are fairly simple. And they can, the feeling they'll have of being able to play a piece they've actually written and notated, I think is really exciting. And because all these dots and lines look so daunting to them often, and actually they're not once they learn how to use them. So I think that's, I think those layers for me was very, very telling.
I'll just add while we're waiting for any further questions, and please do type them in if you have anything to ask. When I'm teaching students to compose melodies over the top of a similar sort of layered project, the things I suppose I concentrate on are, again, improvising, using their MIDI keyboard if they're doing something on the computer. We use Cubase as well at our school, so that's something, you know, that's familiar to them. And but sort of thinking about, you know, where's your starting note, and then remembering that actually a lot of melodies only move by step, or maybe by third, but I always suggest by step to begin with, and that they often repeat a huge amount, and they may only use a few notes to begin with. I find that if you don't give students those sorts of instructions, they can just jump around all the time and create something very kind of disjunct, which then they think doesn't sound very good. And so just giving those kind of little suggestions, actually, no, just, you know, it's in C major, start on C, just go up and down by step a little bit to begin with before you do anything more crazy, and then they'll be able to develop something that perhaps is a bit more musical. The other thing that I often suggest to students, and it sort of depends on your students really and depends on your setup in the classroom, but I often suggest that they actually start by singing or humming over the top, that they listen in their headphones and hum melodies that go over the top, and sometimes that can be a way of breaking down that barrier of maybe keyboard skills or sort of thinking about what notes am I actually using. Students can often be quite intuitive about humming or singing sort of a melody they like the sound of, and you know, it may be that they can then record their singing of that straight into the computer, or it may be that you can then go and just help them work out what the notes are they've actually used. But that can be another way to kind of break down the barrier of how do I go from a short ostinato type layer into a more extended melody.
One thing we use, I must have been in Year 10, but I think you could definitely adapt for younger as well, is we analyse melodies. And in fact, that one I mentioned in Dvorak's Ninth Symphony is a great example because it has the same rhythm. It's 2-bar phrases, and it's the same rhythm again and again and again. Repeat, repeat, repeat. And then repeat the beginning again. So it's, I think it's quite nice. You can find a really, really simple melody to analyse as well. That'll also help them and show them that most great melodies, even famous ones, are actually really, really just very repetitive.
We've just had another question through from Sarah, who's asked, in a progressive curriculum, how do you go about assessment? Do you have some assessment of each skill area in each topic? That's a very good question, and it's something we thought about a lot when we were designing our curriculum. No, we don't assess every single skill in each topic, and that's largely just because in some topics you're learning a huge amount of skills. I mean, as you saw from my earlier skill mapping PowerPoint, you had sort of maybe 8 or 9 skills being learned in some of the topics, and to try and assess all of them, well, I suppose it would be possible, but it would maybe be a bit too much, a bit too time consuming, and ultimately maybe not altogether helpful. So what we do in terms of the assessment is we've chosen sort of either the 2 or the 3 skills that we feel are perhaps the most pertinent to that topic, the ones that their students are going to be developing the most in that topic. And we try and ensure that across the, across each year group really, the students are being assessed on each of the skills 2 or 3 times, but of course not necessarily in each topic. So for example, when I showed you the map earlier on of how we incorporate that particular, it was a creative use of musical devices into different topics. It came up, as you saw, in 6 different topics, and we do assess that particular skill certainly twice in Year 7 in the graphic score and the program music topic, and it gets assessed again in the Year 8 in the samba topic and the ground bass topic, and it gets assessed again in Year 9 in both the film and the pop song project, but it doesn't get assessed in all of the other topics. Sometimes it's not being taught in some of the other ones because they're not composition based, and sometimes they are doing composition but perhaps it's not being developed as much in that particular topic. So we've chosen 2 or 3 skill areas to assess in each one, and we've got a set of criteria. So the way our assessment works in our school is we assess students according to criteria set by the department, and then we just assess their progress according to what their sort of target would be. So in each of our units we might be looking at, say, 2 different skill areas. We would have criteria 1, 2 and 3, where 1 is the most difficult, and we would be able to assess students according to which ones they have achieved. And then in the next topic, where we're assessing that same skill, again we'd have 3 criteria, but this time each of the criteria will be that bit harder. So a student who achieved the best in the first topic would still be progressing if they achieve the best again in the next topic. So our assessment is sort of progressive as well. I hope that makes sense. I'm sorry it's quite hard to explain, but hopefully that gives you a little sense of how we do that. So it looks like we haven't got any more questions coming through at the moment, so I think that's probably about time for us to wrap up. Thank you very much to everybody, and thank you for your questions, and we hope this has been a useful session. And don't forget, you can look it up again on the ISM website. It was ISM/webinars, which will give you the, I'll give you the correct address. It was www.ism.org, /webinars, for you to look this up again after today. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you everyone, and go back to your classrooms and do this stuff.